Welcome back to Final Fantasy as we continue our quest trying to make our way through the volcano and onward to restoring the second orb. It looks like where we left off, we were getting our asses kicked. But okay, that happens sometimes, especially at this point in the game. This, in my opinion, is the hardest part of this entire game. The volcano and the subsequent ice cavern, assuming you do those dungeons in the order that the game expects. The volcano is full of specific enemies that can just completely wipe you out. Specifically, the fire gargoyles. If you get in a fight with a large group of them, and they just blast your whole party with fire too before you can do anything, there's nothing you can do. You can just get a complete party wipe before you can even take an action, especially if they surprise attack you, like those guys just did. And then the ice cavern is just the ice cavern is just a whole other headache with all of its paralysis and instant death you have to deal with. But then after this, the game gets exponentially easier, especially once you start getting a lot of the special magic equipment, like the Zeus hammer, the heal staff, and all these items that have magical effects that allow you to just completely blow through most random battles without ever having to spend any resources. And then the most difficult aspect of the game, which is the resource management, almost completely gets tossed out the window, thus ruining so much of the endgame. I love this game up until you get to, like, the northern continent. The southern continent is great. It's challenging. It really has to make you think about your actions and strategize every single battle, not only to win those battles efficiently, but also to conserve your resources to get through the dungeon. And that's where most of the difficulty in this game, I believe, comes from, is that resource management, needing to go through a dungeon and needing to get through a dungeon and conserve your resources so that you have the strength to do so. Once you get to the second part of the game, so much of that is tossed out the window because you start getting all these magical items that let you cast powerful spells infinitely. And suddenly you're not having to use your magic points as often. You don't really need to use very many heal potions anymore because you've got the heal staff. And if you're using that every turn, yeah, the heal staff doesn't heal very much, but just the fact that you can use heal infinitely just staves off so much of the need to rely on potions and more powerful cure spells to get through the dungeon, especially if you're in a really easy battle or a fight where there's only like one enemy left and you can get off that last free heal before you need to before you end the battle. Especially if the heal can go off and then you can attack and kill that last enemy before they get the chance to do anything. It looks like I accidentally went to the clinic to revive my guys, but then forgot to hit the end before leaving. But I digress. I just got off on a small tangent there for a second because I was discussing what was happening on screen, and that got me on that little tangent. So today we are getting back to the countdown list, the top 10, my top 10 favorite main series Final Fantasy games. We are covering 10 because there happen to be 10 of them that I've played extensively enough to fairly judge, and we are only focusing on the main series, no sequels or spin-offs, just 1 through 16, I think. 16's out, right? I haven't kept up on the series much lately because my only current console is the Switch, so I haven't been able to play the last couple Final Fantasy games. I know there's the Pocket Edition of Final Fantasy 15 on the Switch, but I would rather not subject myself to something like that. I would rather play the game as it's intended or not at all. Or maybe a remake down the line if that ever were to happen many years down the line and that comes out on a console that I happen to have at that point in time. Maybe 15 and 16 will get ported to the Switch too when that comes out. Maybe the Switch 2 will be powerful enough to run those games properly, and we might finally see them, because I'll probably be getting a Switch 2 at some point. It's not that I'm a Nintendo fanboy or anything. It's just that I'm at the point in my life where I don't want to be having multiple consoles. There was a point in time when I would have multiple consoles per generation. I had both the PlayStation and the N64 and the Dreamcast. I also had both the PS2 and the GameCube. I had all three of the Wii, PS3, and Xbox 360. But I'm at a point in my life, especially with how long games are getting. Video games are becoming so ridiculously long nowadays that it's impossible to keep up. A single game can take so much time to get through that I don't have a reason to be buying as many games as I used to, so I also don't need as many consoles. So it's gotten to the point where I'm at a point in my life where I don't think it's worth the money and the investment to be trying to support more than one console at a time. And it just so happens that if I'm going to only be picking one console during any given generation, there's a 99% chance that that console is going to be the Nintendo one, solely because Nintendo has exclusivity to Metroid, which is my second favorite video game franchise of all time, and Pokemon, which is my third favorite video game franchise of all time. So, Nintendo basically has a monopoly on my buying their consoles because of that right there. So, and I don't want to be bothering with more than one console at a time, not counting older or retro consoles. So, I'm not in a position where I can care about the current Microsoft console or the current Sony console, even if some games come out on those that I would like to have. None of those games are generally games that would sell me on getting those consoles. It would take an exceptional release for either the current Sony console or the current Microsoft console in order for me to get either of those at this point or any point in the foreseeable future. I would rather just get the Nintendo console and stick with that. And then just settle with whatever games come out on that console. And if any games come out on the Sony or Microsoft console that I would like to play, well, too bad. It's hardly a loss because I don't have time to play every game I would like to play anyway, so that makes it a lot easier to decide which games to play and which games not to play, because I can automatically cross off anything that comes out on either of those two consoles because there's no competition with them wrestling against the games that are also coming out on the Switch. So that's why I haven't played Final Fantasy 15 or 16. Not that I care too much about them anyway. I don't know a single thing about Final Fantasy 16, but from what I've seen from 15, it doesn't look like it has a proper turn-based battle system, which means I don't care anyway. It's not that turn-based games are the only games I like. Hell, Tales of Symphonia is one of my favorite games of all time, but if it's not a turn-based RPG, then the fact that it's a Final Fantasy game means nothing to me. Any loyalty or interest I have in the franchise is completely erased if it's no longer a turn-based RPG, meaning I'm going to judge it on its own merits and not give a shit if it's a Final Fantasy game. And in that sense, there's a 90% chance that if I'm going to sink 80 hours into a game, I'm going to instead want to be playing whatever the latest turn-based RPG is instead of an action RPG. Just because I prefer turn-based RPGs, and a lot of times if a game isn't a turn-based RPG, again, I like other games. Okami is a game that I love, and that game, first time I beat it, took me about 80 hours, and I enjoyed that all the way through, and that's not a turn-based RPG. There's also multiplayer games that I've sunk a ton of hours into, so it doesn't have to be turn-based RPGs for me to like it. It's just, if I have to decide on a game, but a lot of times, generally speaking, if a game lasts more than like 20 hours and it's not a turn-based RPG, I'm going to lose interest before I beat it. That's why I've pretty much given up on the Zelda series. Not because I think they're bad games. Usually every Zelda game I play I enjoy to some degree, but I never beat them. They never hold my attention long enough because they're way too long for not being turn-based RPGs. And so for something like Final Fantasy 15, unless I'm completely mistaken, based on what I've seen, but based on what I've seen, it's not a turn-based game. But if I'm going to choose, if I'm going into a game knowing it's going to take 40 hours, 80 hours, over 100 hours to get through, if I'm going into a game knowing that that's going to be the case, and the odds are I'm not going to play it unless I know it's also a turn-based RPG. Or, even if I don't know that, even if it might only be a 20-hour game, if I'm trying to pick out a new game to play, and I have a choice between the latest action RPG or the latest turn-based RPG, I'm never going to choose the action one. So the point is that even if, I'm kind of interested in Final Fantasy 15 because it is a Final Fantasy game, so even though it's not a turn-based game to my knowledge, I still have faith that Squaresoft or Square-Enix or whatever would provide us with a good game. So I still have confidence in that. It's just, if it's not a turn-based game, then I don't care as much, but I'm still kind of interested in the game, but definitely not interested enough to get a whole console for it. It's the kind of game it would need to come out on a console that I already have, and I would probably wait until I can find it at a bit of a reduced price, used at GameStop or something. It's not the kind of game I would likely want to purchase brand new at full price, especially with that likelihood that I might not beat it. And as far as I'm concerned, if I don't beat a game, then it wasn't a good game. Because I didn't care enough to experience all. It doesn't matter if I sink 100 hours into it before I get bored. If I didn't beat it, I consider it a waste of my money. At least if it's a game that can be beaten. That doesn't apply, obviously, to games you can't beat. Like games that are strictly multiplayer, or arcade-style games like Donkey Kong or Ice Climber. Anyway, trying to get back on topic, the countdown list. In the last couple episodes, I've been doing that I've already covered entries 10 through 7. Just for a quick refresher, at number 10, we had Final Fantasy X. I just really did not like that game. It's the only game on this list that I've never beaten, which ties into what I was just saying about if I don't retain interest enough in a game to beat it, then I consider it to have been a waste of money and just a bad game. Doesn't matter how much time I put into it prior to that. If I didn't beat it, I didn't like it. And then at number 9, there's Final Fantasy II. which I still think is a terrible game, but I have beaten it. I don't remember, I think I brought this up in that episode, but thinking about Final Fantasy II, I think I can sincerely say that Final Fantasy II is my favorite game that I don't like. Of all the video games that I do not like that I think are bad games, I think I can confidently say that Final Fantasy II is my favorite game of all of those games that I just think are bad games and I don't like. And then after that, though, we get to the good games. The games that are good, but I just think so, but I prefer some more than others. And of course, this is all just my opinions. This isn't an objective judgment of these games or anything ridiculous like that. I'm not an authority who can judge games based on that. I could try. There are definitely some games that I think are objectively bad or objectively great, including some that I like or hate. There are some games, movies as well, there are some games that I think are objectively bad games, but I thoroughly enjoy just because they do specific things that I like. Likewise, there are also certain games that I acknowledge for being objectively phenomenal games, but I don't like them, I just don't give a shit. Going back to Zelda, there's Ocarina of Time. I never really liked that game. I think it's a good game, it just bored me to tears. It is one of the Zelda games I've beaten, though. One of the very few Zelda games I've beaten, but that was only because my friends and my brother and all of us were playing the game at the same time, so it was a very strong talking point between us. We would be at school or hanging out after school talking about the game, playing it together, talking about where we are on our current files and maybe any secrets we've found and whatnot. So it was a very topical game at the time, and that kept me into it. I kept playing it largely because of that, because it was such a topical game. That was keeping me more invested than I would have been if I was just playing it 100% on my own without any of that interaction with friends or anything. Anyway, at number 8 on our list, we had Final Fantasy VII, and then at number 7, we had Final Fantasy IV. I had to keep looking over at my list just to make sure those were in the right order, because last time I talked about that even though I put Final Fantasy IV above Final Fantasy VII, those could go either way. I could easily swap those. They are so close to each other that I could easily put one over the other and think that's perfectly fine. Again, you could ask me in like a week, and I could, which game I like more between Final Fantasy VII and Final Fantasy IV, and I could give you a completely different answer. Hence, even just now, like I said, I was having to look at my notes just to double check. With the other two, I knew. I knew Final Fantasy X was at 10, that's easy. I knew Final Fantasy II was at 9, that's easy. Some of the ones coming up, I could just tell you right now off the top of my head where they rank. And you could ask me the same question 5 years from now and that probably won't have changed. But with 7 and 2, I just discussed this recently, yet I had to look over at my notes just to make sure that what I was saying in this episode is consistent with what I said previously, just because of how that can change. Even now talking about it, I'm sitting here thinking, would I really put Final Fantasy IV above Final Fantasy VII? Like, I'm questioning myself right now in regards to that decision. That's how close they are together. The only reason I put one above the other is because, for the sake of the list, there needs to be an entry for every number. You can't have two games on one entry. That's kind of like cheating for something like this. Unless it's a case of multiple games effectively being one game. Like if I were doing a countdown list of the Shining series, I would probably put all 3 scenarios of Shining Force 3 as one entry. Just because they're all one game. It's 3 separate games, but they all collectively come together to tell the one story. And it's not even so much like they're sequels to each other, because they're telling concurrent stories. Scenario 1 and Scenario 2 both start and end at the exact same point in time. And Scenario 3 picks up about halfway through their story. And there's even features that carry, well, not features, but there's secrets that carry over from one to the next. In order to recruit a specific character in Scenario 2, you have to rescue him in Scenario 1, otherwise he's left to die. For example. Or there's a character whose life you have to spare in Scenario 1, otherwise she dies and you can't recruit her in Scenario 3. So, in that sort of sense, I would put, if I was doing a Shining series list, I would put all 3 scenarios of Shining Force 3 as one entry, just because they're effectively all one game, and I would never play one or the other. If I'm going to play Shining Force 3, I'm playing all 3 of them back to back, because they're not structured like separate games. They're structured more like a 3-disc game, but each single disc is a full 40 to 50 hour game, rather than each disc only being about 10 hours long like you would normally see from a multi-disc game of that era. Anyway, getting back on topic again, I keep rambling in this episode. Probably because I don't have a whole lot to say about the next games. So I'm just going on and on and on. I'm not feeling rushed. In the previous episodes, I felt rushed. A little rushed anyway, to get to the point. To not waste so much time, to make sure that I could get through the entries in a timely manner. But with this one, I don't really have much to say about the games, and I'll get to why in a second. But what I just said about 7 and 4, that's relevant here as well, because the next 2 games on the list, I feel very similarly about. A little less conflicted, I think, because I care about the games a little bit more. Final Fantasy VII I like, but it's also kind of meh. I've never, aside from when it first came out, I've never really loved Final Fantasy as much as a lot of people. And Final Fantasy IV I used to think was great. And I probably still would to this day, except for the fact that I've played it to death. I played that game so much growing up that I'm just sick of it. And so that's why 4 is lower on the list. If it weren't for that, basically being fatigued on the game because of my history with it, I would probably rate Final Fantasy IV at number 5 or 6 on this list instead of number 7. But anyway, so these next 2 games fall in a similar vein in that I have placements for them now, but if you were to ask me in a few weeks which of these games I like more, I might give a completely different answer. And by the way, I don't know if it's going to show up like that in the final recording or anything, But these walls, especially in that last room with all the lava, these walls on the recording I'm watching are going nuts. Graphically going crazy whenever I'm walking through the lava. That's not supposed to happen. I'm pretty sure that's just a recording, because if you're just playing the game, it doesn't do that. I think the recording just... something screwed up with the recording from all those flashing lights when walking through the lava, and it's affecting how the walls look. It's causing them to flicker red or have red patches appear on them. So if you're seeing that, that isn't a normal thing. Anyway, so entries 5 and 6, those are the same in that I could take or leave where they are on this list. And so to put it simply, I'll just say right now, at number 6, we have Final Fantasy III, and at number 5, we have Final Fantasy I. Both of these games are very similar. Final Fantasy I obviously set the groundwork for the series. Final Fantasy II was very experimental, very different, but that, I felt, was a common thing on the NES. A lot of sequels tried to do very different things because the developers didn't really know what they were doing yet, or they didn't know what would stick. They made a great game, and then they wanted to try something different, maybe just so the sequel wouldn't feel too much like the prequel. Maybe they felt like they needed to do something different. Otherwise, people wouldn't care. They wouldn't bother buying the new one. Because why waste money on the new game when they still have the first one and it's basically the same thing? Or maybe they were just trying new things. Maybe they thought, okay, this game worked really well. What kind of completely different game can we make now? While riding the popularity of the first game. Like, what kind of, I wouldn't be surprised if this was their thought process at times. What kind of new game can we make? A brand new, original, fresh game can we make and use the success of our previous game to promote this new game and try some new ideas? Final Fantasy II was like that. Very, very astronomically different game from the first Final Fantasy. It had some of the same core ideas and mechanics, being a turn-based game, similar graphics, a lot of similar spells and items, but very different fundamentally with how it worked. Same thing with Zelda. Zelda 1 was the overhead game, and Zelda 2 is a side-scrolling platformer with a much stronger emphasis on action and navigating complex mazes as opposed to collecting items to expand your arsenal and using those items to overcome various challenges. You were getting spells to overcome various challenges or having to navigate much more complex mazes, or even if not more complex, just very different in how they were designed. Fire Emblem did the same thing. I can't remember exactly what the differences were because I'm not super familiar with Fire Emblem. I've played the first 2 games on NES for the very first time a few years ago. I haven't moved on to the 3rd one yet. I wanted to go through all of them in order, but I took a break when I got to the 3rd one because I knew it was heavily a remake of the first game, and I just played through the first game like a month or 2 prior, so I wasn't really feeling super motivated to jump straight into the 3rd one. And then since then, it's probably been about 3 years or so by this point, maybe even 4 years, and I just haven't gotten around to getting to it yet. But Fire Emblem 1 and 2 were both very different. They were both still tactical RPGs with permadeath and everything, so it had a lot of the same core fundamentals, but there were also a lot of things that were very different with how the game worked. One thing I just remembered was that there was exploration. There's actually free roaming exploration in some dungeons, and I think even random battles that could trigger in certain areas, but I can't remember if that was the case or if I'm just making that up. Whereas the first Fire Emblem had no free roaming exploration, and I doubt many of the other ones do either. And even if you lived in America, this doesn't apply if you lived in Japan, but if you lived in America, Super Mario Bros. Was also very much like that. It had the first game and then the second one that was astronomically different from the first game. So the NES felt very much like that. It felt very experimental with its sequels. And then I felt like after they did the first game and then the second one, then they could look back and be like, okay, which of these games did better? And which should we then expand upon with the third game? And I feel like it was always the first. I feel like it was always the first game that they followed suit on. With Zelda, just about every Zelda game that came after the second one followed the first game's example. Final Fantasy, they kept following the first game's example, instead using Final Fantasy II as a foundation to start a brand new series, to start their Saga series, and a lot of similar ideas were carried over from Final Fantasy II into that. So that was a little different. Final Fantasy II it didn't really pave the way for future Final Fantasy games so much as it provided Square with a foundation for a new franchise. Where was I going with this? Oh, right, Final Fantasy. So Final Fantasy 1 and Final Fantasy 3, following that trend on the NES of having one original game, having a sequel that's vastly different, and then having a third game that goes back to the style of the first game. Final Fantasy 1 and Final Fantasy 3 are very similar. Final Fantasy 3 very much just feels like an expanded version of the first game. It has a similar story focusing on the crystals. It has a similar battle system with jobs and enemies and spells. Only they kind of expanded everything. The job system is more of an actual system. Instead of just choosing your 4 characters right at the start of the game, you can change your jobs as you progress and you unlock new ones as you go. You start off with just the onion kids, which are just generic, completely weak and useless fighters who don't really have any exceptional qualities, at least until you overlevel yourself and their stats skyrocket. But no sane person that I can imagine would ever get to those levels. If you got to those levels, then either you have nothing better to do with your time but mindlessly grind in a game, or you're so bad at RPGs that you need your stats to be that high in order to succeed. But yeah, so it has an actual job system, and but it also does some things that are worse. Like, it sort of has ineffective attacks. I mean, that's one of the weirdest things about Final Fantasy 3 is basic attacks don't have ineffective attacks, but spells still do. Spells can still be ineffective if they target a dead enemy. And I kind of miss the ineffective attacks. Not having ineffective attacks makes the game more convenient, but it also takes a lot of the strategy out of the game. I think right there I was trying to remember whether or not I'd grabbed those chests yet or not, because the chests don't show themselves being open in this game. It's kind of annoying. So yeah, so I like that they removed the ineffective attacks, but I also kind of wish they were still there in full force. They're still there with magic though, so you still have to put some thought into your actions, especially because you don't want to be wasting magic points. But now you can also freely multi-target enemies in the third game. The dungeons are also better. There's more bosses. But there's also a lot less resource management. A lot of the difficulty comes more from genuinely difficult and interesting combat scenarios, as opposed to the first game, where most of the difficulty comes from resource management, and especially early on in the game, hoping, or at least in this like midway part of the game, hoping you don't get your party completely wiped out by insta-death or group attacks. So the first game's strategy and challenge focuses much more on resource management and making it to the end of dungeons with resources remaining, as opposed to, and then having to defeat a boss while you're on your last leg, as opposed to the third game, which is much more lenient with its resources, but has more genuinely interesting combat scenarios. So here's the thing, though, with Final Fantasy 1 and Final Fantasy 3. As far as Final Fantasy 1 goes, I feel like I've already extensively covered it, I'm pretty sure, during the first 2 or 3 episodes of this series. I went into my thoughts about this game, my opinions about its systems, my thoughts on everything, basically. I also talked about how the game works. I know I did that, and I'm pretty sure while doing that, I expressed a lot of my thoughts about that. So I feel like discussing my opinions and why it's placed on here at this point would be kind of redundant. I place it over the other games because of the stuff I said, and also kind of why I place it over Final Fantasy 3. Going back to the objective stuff, objectively speaking, I do think Final Fantasy 3 is a better game. It has better characters, better story. It actually has an interesting story. This first game is just restore the orbs. That's it. Yes, you meet people along the way, and there's a lot of little quests you have to go on while you're on that mission. But it's not very interesting, and even then, there's very little story to it. In fact, most of this game's story you can skip if you already know where to go and don't have the need to talk to NPCs, because a lot of this game's story is triggered or discovered by talking to optional characters and figuring out where you're supposed to go. But if you already know where you're supposed to go, then you don't need that. Hey, you can just go along on your merry way, never experiencing the game's story. Final Fantasy 3 actually has a lot of moments where you have to talk to specific characters in order to progress. Otherwise, certain events just won't trigger. So you actually have to experience the game's story. There's also the job system, which allows you much more customization throughout the game. You're not committed to your 4 characters you chose at the start and forced to stick with that same build, that same strategy throughout the entire game. You're constantly evolving and changing your options as you go, making for an overall more interesting experience, so to speak. It's also just more expansive, the dungeons are more interesting, the difficulty is a little less bullshit. A lot of times when you die in Final Fantasy 1, assuming you don't know what you're doing, Final Fantasy 1 can be a lot more difficult if you don't know what you're doing, but if you are extensively familiar with the game and you know what you're doing, you're probably not going to get game overs unless you just push your luck because you get overconfident, or situations that are just outside of your control happen, like earlier this episode, where 3 of my guys got smacked by Paralisks and insta-killed, so I had to leave the dungeon, and then on my way back to town, my soul black mage just couldn't survive. because the turn order didn't benefit him enough to run from battles or debilitate enemies, and he just got pummeled. There was nothing I could really do about that. It just happened. And of course, stuff like that can happen in Final Fantasy III as well, but the difficulty in that game, for the most part, until the final dungeon, where the game becomes absolute bullshit, is more fair. It's more balanced and it's more interesting. And it feels like when you do lose, you yourself had a little bit more control over that outcome than in the first game. Also, you can save. You can just freely save without using a tent or a inn. That's also a huge plus in the first game. Or I mean the third game. But the third game also has dungeons that are sometimes way too long. And that can be a little troublesome, especially if you have limited time. The first game also has some long dungeons, but once you know where you're going, most of them are pretty short. Except for the final dungeon. The final dungeon, even if you know exactly what you're doing, unless you're using a ninja or something to just run from every battle, it's probably gonna still take you a good 60 to 90 minutes to get through the final dungeon in the first game. But compare that to the final dungeon in the third game that can take about 3 hours to get through without a save point, and with enemies that, if you're not prepared, can basically one-shot your entire party with a single spell cast. And that's nothing. But the first game, so in that sense, the first game is a little more user-friendly because you won't have to commit so much time in one sitting to making progress. Whereas with Final Fantasy III, especially once you start getting further, that becomes a bit more of a problem. Anyway, so with Final Fantasy I, I feel like I've discussed so much of the game already, unless I'm completely mistaken. But even if I'm not mistaken, there's still plenty of time to discuss the game. And I like most of what it does. I like the ineffective attacks because they make the game more tactical and strategic and more punishing if you don't play well. It keeps you engaged in every fight because you can't just win battles by mashing the A button like in a lot of other RPGs. I like how limited your resources are. Especially with spells, you don't get very many magic points, so you can't just fire off your spells all willy-nilly. You really have to stop and think about how to use your spells and when to use which spells, as opposed to when to hold on to them, so that you don't blow through all your resources halfway through a dungeon and then wind up screwed because you can't make it through the other half. I like the job system because it provides you with everything you need, and the jobs are different enough that every playthrough of the game can be a little different. I like how with each level of spell, you can only choose 3 out of the 4 spells available. That's actually another thing I like about Final Fantasy I more than Final Fantasy III, that puts it just that little bit above Final Fantasy III, is the spell customization. In Final Fantasy III, it has the same system of 8 spell levels, and with both white magic and black magic, you buy your spells. There's also summons in that game, but there's only one summon spell per level, as opposed to multiples with black and white. But here's the thing. In Final Fantasy I, like I just said, there are 4 spells per level, but you can only have 3 spells in your spell book per level. So for every level, and this is even more so the case with the red mage, but with both the white mage and the black mage, every single spell level, you have to choose one spell to not learn. And so that's a decision you have to make that in turn makes the game more interesting and can make each playthrough a little bit different. Just because you're using a black mage in one run and then a black mage in another run, that doesn't mean your black mage is going to function exactly the same in both runs. You could have one run where you have a black mage that focuses on just obliterating shit with powerful attack spells, and then you could have another run where your black mage focuses entirely on support, casting spells, learning spells like sleep and confusion and focusing more on those, and even learning some spells that you might not conventionally bother to learn because they're not as generally useful, like Lock 2. Lock 2 isn't a very good spell, especially because it's competing with Fire 2, Lightning 2, and Hold, all of which are more useful spells in most situations. So, but maybe you do a run where you want your black mage to play a more supportive role, and you want your power coming more from your fighters just to mix things up. You can do that. Final Fantasy III detracts from that element by making it so each spell level for both white and black magic only has 3 spells, meaning you learn, unless you're using a red mage or a sage later on in the game, because they can use multiple types of spells, but with both the white mage and the black mage, you're always going to have the same spells every single run because you only have the 3 to choose from, and each level still holds 3 spells in your spellbook per level. So every single run, your black mage and your white mage are going to know the exact same spells, and that in turn makes the customization of them less interesting. So in some ways, the character customization and development is more interesting in the third game, but there are also, in fact, in most ways, it's more interesting in the third game. Especially when you start getting into things like job levels to become more proficient with certain jobs, or utilizing jobs in certain ways to get different hit point gains when you level up, blah blah blah. But in the first game, but the point is, if you use a black mage in Final Fantasy III during one run, and then in your next run, use a black mage again, those 2 black mages are going to be exactly the same, because there's no choices to make with their spells. Whereas with Final Fantasy I, there is choices to make with their spells, so you could have a completely different black mage on one run than you did on another run. That said though, one thing I kind of wish Final Fantasy I had was just a couple more jobs. This is something I've felt even when I was a kid. I'm not entirely sure what they would do with those jobs. I discussed some ideas on my discussion episode where I talked about the Final Fantasy Renaissance remake. That's the fan remake that somebody did that just kind of, it's not a ROM hack or anything, it's an actual standalone game that adds a whole bunch of extra stuff that I think went way too overboard. But it had some good, but I discussed in my episode talking about that, I discussed my thoughts on the jobs in that, at least the jobs at the time. I believe I checked recently, and since I made that video, there has been, I think there's been at least one new job added. But I discussed my thoughts on those jobs and how I think I would have rather seen them implemented in a way that still makes them interesting, but doesn't so strongly overhaul the original game's experience in order to make those jobs work. And thinking about that, I do feel like there is room for a couple new jobs in this game. And I've always kind of wished that there were more. Not a ton, just like 2 more jobs would be fine, especially for replaying the game. So that every time I replay the game, I would have a little bit more diversity in regards to how I could approach it and what I could do to make the run more interesting. Oh, Black just took a shit ton of damage there. Anyway, so that's one thing that is better about Final Fantasy 3 is that it has a ton more jobs, so there's a lot more ways you can diversify each run of the game. But yeah, so that's another one of the big reasons why I prefer Final Fantasy 1 over Final Fantasy 3 is just I think it's more replayable. It's the kind of game that I can just pick up and play, and it's so easy to get into, and it's so short. And for me, when it comes to replay value in a game, shorter is better. If a game is long, that kills its replay value, because generally speaking, if I'm replaying a game that I've beaten before, I'm doing so on a whim. And that whim might pass within a day or two or a week or whatever. So if I don't have enough time, and if I don't have enough time to beat the game before that whim passes, then I'll be left feeling like I wasted my time even bothering to play the game. So, if I'm in the mood to play a game, and that game is like 40 hours long, I have to stop and ask myself, am I enough in the mood to play this game? Am I 40 hours, I feel like playing this game, but am I 40 hours in the mood of playing this game? So just as a way to put it. And Final Fantasy 1 works really well with that because I can beat it quickly for an RPG. It's not as quick, obviously, as like an old platformer or something, but still, it's short, especially since I know what I'm doing. I can get through it really quickly. In like 15 hours or less, usually, I think. So that makes it much more accessible for replaying, as opposed to something longer, like, I don't know, something like, looking over at my games, something like Chrono Cross, for example. Chrono Cross, that's such an investment that even if I'm in the mood to play the game, there's a very high likelihood that I'm not 40 hours in the mood to play the game. I might only be 10 hours in the mood to play the game. So I'm just not gonna play it. And I'll just do something else instead. So the shorter a game is, the better its replay value. And Final Fantasy 1 is shorter than Final Fantasy 3. So even if there are a lot of things I like more about Final Fantasy 3, there are also a number of things I like more about Final Fantasy 1, and regardless, even if I liked Final Fantasy 3 more, I would still be more likely to revisit Final Fantasy 1 because it's shorter and therefore more replayable. Anyway, so, with Final Fantasy 1, like I said, I'm pretty sure I discussed a lot of my specific thoughts about the game. And also, as far as Final Fantasy 3 goes, between the time that I've been finding the time to record this series, I also did a complete Let's Play of Final Fantasy 3, which will be coming out eventually. And throughout that, I naturally discussed a lot of my thoughts about that game. So I feel like discussing Final Fantasy 1 in depth in the way that I did the past games on this list would be redundant because I'm pretty sure I've already talked a lot about it, and I've done some talking about it here today. But I feel like I've talked a fair bit about the game, again, unless I'm just misremembering. So I feel like going into a lot of the specifics with this game in the same way that I did the past 4 games on this list would be redundant. And likewise, if I did that with Final Fantasy III, then it would make a lot of my thoughts about Final Fantasy III redundant when I get to explaining those in that series, which will be going up at some point after this. That series is already done and recorded and even completely edited by this point, but I want to get through all of Final Fantasy I before moving on to Final Fantasy III. And maybe even Final Fantasy II. I recently had an idea for a different sort of Final Fantasy II video, but that will probably just be one video, sort of similar to this, not a complete playthrough of that game. But it's something that crossed my mind just today, in fact, or maybe it was yesterday. Either way, it's an idea that crossed my mind, so a single Final Fantasy II video may be coming after this run of Final Fantasy I is finished, and then after that, we should be getting into the complete Let's Play that I did of Final Fantasy III, and in that, I'll be discussing a lot of my thoughts about that game, and so I would make a lot of those thoughts redundant if I discussed them here. It would be different if I had recorded this, then later did a Final Fantasy III Let's Play, but just knowing that that's coming makes me aware of the fact that this information could become redundant, and so I just don't feel like repeating what's been said on that here, at least very extensively. You can just wait until that series comes out to hear my extensive thoughts on Final Fantasy III, especially since it's a long game for an NES game, so I had plenty of time to talk about it as the game progressed. So one last sound off as we are now halfway through this Final Fantasy top 10 list of mine. At number 5, we have Final Fantasy I. At number 6, we have Final Fantasy III. At number 7, we have Final Fantasy IV. At number 8, we have Final Fantasy VII. At number 9, we have Final Fantasy II. And at number 10, we appropriately have Final Fantasy X. That's just a weird coincidence that I find oddly amusing. More amusing than it should be. But now, after this, so blah 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 blah. So, join us next time, and we will move on to the next entries. Probably do 2 of them again. That's how it's been going so far anyway. If I happen to squeeze more entries into a single video, then it'll happen, but so far that hasn't been the case. So next time, at the very least, we should be discussing entries 4 and 3. Stay tuned for what those will be, and I'll see you next time.